In the morning, my son texted me, "Don't come to the wedding. My wife's family is afraid you'll embarrass them." The next day, I withdrew all my money, changed my will, and disappeared. When they looked for me, I woke up before the sun that morning the way I always did, not because I needed to be anywhere early, but because my body had never learned how to sleep in. 67 years of getting up before the day started does that to you. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after you have lived alone long enough for silence to stop feeling like an interruption and start feeling like a routine. I shuffled into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and stood there waiting for the familiar click that meant the water was hot enough. I remember thinking about the tie I had laid out the night before the blue one. Helen liked the one she said made me look less like a construction foreman and more like a man who knew how to sit still. I had laughed when she said that years ago, but I wore that tie anyway. I planned to wear it to my son's wedding. I did not need to be noticed. I just wanted to be there. My phone buzzed on the counter while the kettle was heating. At first I ignored it. I figured it was one of those reminder alerts I kept forgetting to turn off a pharmacy notice or a weather update. It buzzed again. I wiped my hands on my jeans and picked it up, already annoyed at myself for letting a piece of plastic interrupt a perfectly quiet morning. The message was from my son. It was short. No greeting, no easing into it. He told me not to come to the wedding. He said his wife's family was afraid I would embarrass them. I read it once, then I read it again. Then I set the phone back down on the counter as if it had burned me. The kettle clicked off behind me sharp and loud in the stillness, but I did not move to pour the water. I just stood there staring at the wall above the sink, where the paint was slightly darker from years of steam and cooking. Embarrass them. That word stayed with me. It echoed in my head in a way that felt heavier than anger. It was not rage I felt first. It was a kind of hollow pressure, like when you step into a room and realize everyone has already been talking about you. I tried to think of it as a misunderstanding, some awkward phrasing that would make sense once I talked to him. But even as I reached for my phone again, I knew that was not true. Messages like that do not come from confusion. They come from decisions that have already been made. I sat down at the small kitchen table and wrapped both hands around my mug, even though I had not poured any coffee yet. The chair across from me was empty the way it had been every morning since Helen died. For a moment, I thought about what she would have said if she were there. She would not have raised her voice. She never did. She would have asked one quiet question that cut straight through all the excuses. I imagined her asking why. Not why they were worried about embarrassment, but why a father had become something to hide. I thought about the wedding itself, what it was supposed to be. Not the country club, not the guest list, not the speeches or the photos. To me, it was supposed to be a marker, one of those moments you collect as you get older, the kind you replay when you are sitting alone with nothing but time. I was not planning to give a toast. I was not planning to dance in the middle of the floor. I just wanted to stand off to the side, shake a few hands, and feel that quiet pride you get when you realize your child has made it to a place you once worried he never would. The message made it clear that even that was too much. I picked up the phone again, my thumb hovering over his name. I could already hear the explanations before they were spoken. He would say it was not his idea, that it was complicated, that weddings were stressful, and everyone was sensitive. He would tell me it did not mean anything, that we would have dinner another time. I had heard those kinds of explanations before in different forms over the years. They always sounded reasonable on the surface. They always left the same taste behind. I put the phone back down. There was a time when I would have called anyway, pushed past my discomfort, done whatever was necessary to smooth things over. I had spent most of my adult life doing that, fixing problems before they became uncomfortable, stepping in quietly, so my son's life could keep moving without friction. Somewhere along the way, that habit had turned into an expectation. I stood up and poured the hot water over the grounds, watching the coffee bloom and darken. The smell filled the kitchen, grounding me in something familiar. I carried the mug back to the table and sat down again, this time facing the window. The street outside was empty, the lawn still damp with morning dew. It looked like every other morning I had lived through in that house. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. As I sat there, memories came back in fragments, not as a single timeline, but as flashes. Writing checks when money was tight, taking on extra work so my son could go to a better school, sitting in uncomfortable folding chairs at school events, pretending my knees did not hurt, because it mattered to him that I showed up. I had never thought of those things as sacrifices. They were just what you did when you were a parent. Somewhere in the last few years, though, the balance had shifted. I had felt it in small ways, in the way conversations were rushed, in how decisions were made and then explained to me afterward, in how my presence was appreciated when it was useful and inconvenient when it was visible. The text message did not create that reality. It confirmed it. I looked around the kitchen at the small repairs I had done myself, the shelves I had built with leftover lumber, the marks on the floor where furniture had been dragged and rearranged over decades. This house had seen better days, but it was honest. It did not pretend to be something it was not. For the first time since the phone buzzed, I felt something settle in me. Not peace exactly, but clarity. I realized that the problem was not the wedding. The problem was that somewhere along the line, I had allowed myself to become invisible unless I was needed. I had mistaken being helpful for being valued. I thought again about calling my son. I thought about driving over to his place and asking him to look me in the eye and repeat what he had written. But I already knew what would happen. He would avoid my gaze. He would talk about logistics and timing, and how none of this was personal. He would say just enough to soothe his own guilt, and not enough to change anything. I took a slow sip of coffee and felt the warmth spread through my chest. The day was just beginning. People were waking up, getting dressed, moving toward a celebration they believed would mark the start of something new. For me, it marked something else. I was not angry yet. That would come later, if it came at all. What I felt was a quiet recognition that I had reached the end of a role I never agreed to play. I was done being the part of the story that was edited out when it no longer fit the picture. I finished my coffee and rinsed the mug, setting it upside down in the rack. I picked up my phone one last time and read the message again, slowly letting each word land without flinching. Then I set the phone face down on the table and walked into the bedroom. The tie was still there, neatly folded on the dresser. I picked it up, ran my fingers over the fabric and placed it back in the drawer. There would be no wedding for me to attend that day. I did not know exactly what I was going to do next. I only knew what I was not going to do. I was not going to argue. I was not going to explain myself. And I was not going to pretend that this was a small thing. I closed the drawer, turned off the light, and walked back into the quiet house, already aware that whatever came next would change more than just my plans for the weekend. I sat at the kitchen table long after the phone went dark, my coffee untouched, the morning light creeping across the floor, like it was unsure whether it belonged there. The message kept replaying in my head, not the words themselves, but the way they landed flat and efficient, like a door quietly locking from the other side. I had spent most of my adult life believing that if you stayed useful, if you stayed generous, you stayed included. That belief didn't shatter all at once. It cracked slowly the way old concrete does silently until you step on it and realize there is nothing solid underneath. I told myself not to react. That was always my strength. When problems showed up at work, I never raised my voice. I assessed. I waited. I gathered facts. Emotion had a way of making expensive mistakes, so I did what I had done for decades. I waited for context. I waited for a follow-up. I waited for my son to call and explain that something had come out wrong, that someone else had overstepped, that it wasn't what it sounded like. The call never came. By mid-morning, the house felt too quiet. Not peaceful quiet, but the kind that makes you aware of every sound your own body makes. The refrigerator cycling, the clock ticking, my own breathing. I realized how much of my routine had been built around availability, being on standby, being ready in case someone needed something, a ride, advice, a check, a solution. That morning, no one needed me. Or worse, they had decided they didn't want me. I went upstairs and opened the closet where my suit hung, the one I had planned to wear to the wedding. It was still in its garment bag, pressed untouched. I had taken it out the week before and checked the fit standing in front of the mirror, adjusting the cuffs like a man trying to reassure himself that he still belonged somewhere important. I ran my hand along the sleeve now, then zipped the bag closed and pushed it back into the corner. The gesture felt final, even though I hadn't said anything out loud. I told myself to stay busy. That was another habit. Idleness invited doubt. I sorted mail that didn't need sorting. I wiped down a counter that was already clean. I stood at the window and watched a delivery truck idle across the street longer than necessary. Around noon, my phone buzzed again. For a moment, my chest tightened. Then I saw it was a calendar reminder. Dentist appointment next week. I dismissed it and set the phone face down. That was when the anger tried to surface, sharp and tempting. Not loud anger, the quiet kind that tells you that you have been made a fool of. I could have leaned into it. I could have rehearsed speeches, imagined confrontations, pictured myself demanding explanations. I didn't. Somewhere deeper than anger was a colder realization. If they were comfortable excluding me without a conversation, then any conversation now would be performative. Explanations would be cosmetic. Apologies would be strategic. I remembered a line my wife used to say when people disappointed her. She said, "Pay attention to what people do when they think you are not watching. That tells you more than what they say when they know you are listening." She had been right about most things in life, especially about people. By the afternoon, I understood something else that unsettled me even more. I had been waiting not because I needed information, but because I was hoping for permission to feel hurt, permission to act, permission to change. That waiting was a form of dependence I had never acknowledged. As long as I waited, the situation was still in their hands. I sat back down at the kitchen table, pulled my phone toward me, and unlocked it. I didn't scroll through messages. I didn't reread the text. I opened my contacts and stopped when I reached a name I hadn't touched in years, a lawyer I had worked with long before my son's life became the center of my decisions, back when my priorities were clearer and my boundaries firmer. I didn't call him yet. I just let the name sit on the screen. Instead, I stood up and walked through the house slowly, the way you do when you are taking inventory, without admitting that is what you were doing. Every room held evidence of a life built around providing. Framed photos from graduations, furniture chosen for durability, not style. A guest room that had become a default space for visits that came with expectations. I noticed how many things I had postponed for myself because someone else might need something first. The thought came quietly without drama. What if I stopped being available? Not as punishment, not as leverage, just as a boundary. The idea felt both frightening and relieving. Frightening because it meant letting go of a role that had defined me for years. Relieving because it meant I could finally step out of reaction mode. Around 4 in the afternoon, I finally made the call. My voice sounded steady when the receptionist answered. I asked if he was available sometime this week, not urgently, just a conversation. She put me on hold. When she came back, she said he could see me the next morning. I thanked her and hung up. The decision didn't feel dramatic. It felt administrative, like scheduling maintenance before a small problem became a catastrophic one. I didn't tell anyone about the appointment. There was no one to tell. That realization stung more than I expected. That evening, I cooked dinner for myself without rushing. Something simple, nothing celebratory. As I ate, I thought about the wedding preparations happening somewhere else, the seating charts, the rehearsed smiles, the conversations about appearances. I wondered how my absence was being explained, if it was being explained at all. The thought didn't provoke anger anymore. It confirmed something I had already accepted. If my presence was optional, then my resources should not be assumed. After dinner, I sat in the living room with the lights off, watching the sky darken through the window. My phone buzzed once, a short message this time, a logistical question phrased casually as if nothing had happened. I didn't respond, not because I was trying to make a point, but because responding would have reinforced the old pattern: immediate availability, automatic compliance. The silence that followed was heavy but honest. It forced me to confront a truth I had avoided for years. Being needed had become a substitute for being respected. As long as I kept solving problems, no one had to consider my limits, or my dignity. That night, I slept poorly. Not from anxiety, but from adjustment. My mind kept circling the same idea, turning it over like a piece of metal under inspection. Disappearing didn't mean vanishing physically. It meant withdrawing access. It meant removing myself from systems that treated my presence as optional and my support as mandatory. When I woke up before dawn, the decision was already made. I wasn't angry. I wasn't sad. I felt something closer to resolve. The kind that doesn't announce itself. The kind that moves quietly and leaves no room for negotiation. I showered, dressed, and sat back down at the kitchen table. the same place where the message had landed the day before. This time, the light felt different, sharper, more honest. I picked up my phone and looked at the calendar again. Wedding day circled in bold. I deleted the event. Whatever came next, it would not involve asking to be included. It would involve choosing myself for the first time in a long while. I finished my coffee, stood up, and gathered the documents I knew I would need. There was work to do, and waiting was no longer part of the plan. The house looked the same when I pulled into the driveway, but I felt like a guest the moment I stepped inside. That sensation caught me off guard. I had keys. I paid the taxes. I had fixed the roof with my own hands years ago. Still, the air felt borrowed, as if decisions had been made here without me, and the walls were holding on to the secret. I hadn't come with a plan. I told myself I was only stopping by to pick up a folder I had left in the study during my last visit. That was true, but it wasn't the whole truth. Something in me needed to see the place again to confirm that what I was feeling wasn't paranoia or wounded pride. I needed evidence, even if I didn't yet know what kind. The front hallway smelled faintly of fresh flowers, the kind arranged to impress guests not to live with. Shoes were lined up neatly by the door, none of them mine. I noticed that first, then told myself it meant nothing. Families grow, houses change. I moved toward the study, my footsteps quieter than usual, as if I didn't want to announce myself to the furniture. The study door was ajar. Inside, the desk was cluttered in a way I didn't recognize. My son had always been meticulous even as a boy. Disorder made him anxious. Now there were loose papers stacked unevenly, envelopes, half-opened, a trash bin filled to the top and pushed carelessly against the desk leg. That was when the unease sharpened into focus. I stood there for a moment, telling myself to grab the folder and leave. Instead, my eyes kept returning to the trash bin. Years of running a business had trained me to notice patterns, especially when something didn't fit. Important documents never went into open trash. They were shredded, filed, locked away. The carelessness bothered me more than curiosity did. I crouched down slowly, as if sudden movement might set something off. On top were receipts, empty packaging, nothing unusual. Beneath that folded paper with official letterhead caught my eye. I hesitated. There was a line you don't cross easily as a parent. Privacy mattered. Trust mattered. Then I remembered the message the way I had been erased from a day that was supposed to be about family. Silence had already crossed the line for them. I unfolded the paper carefully. It was informational material, not personal correspondence. A brochure describing elder care services, not a luxury community or an independent living facility. This was something else. The language was clinical, stripped of warmth. Words like placement, supervision, compliance. It emphasized affordability, government coordination, eligibility requirements. I read it twice then, a third time, waiting for context to appear. It didn't. My first reaction wasn't fear. It was confusion. I was healthy, independent, still working part-time. There had been no conversations about care, no concerns raised. I set the brochure on the desk and continued sorting through the bin, my movements steady, deliberate. That was when I found the email. It had been printed, then torn in half and crumpled as if someone had changed their mind about discarding it properly. I smoothed it out, aligning the edges, like I used to align blueprints. The sender was not my son. It was my daughter-in-law. The recipient was an administrator at a facility I had never heard of. The tone was polite, concerned, carefully worded. She wrote about changes in behavior, increasing confusion, difficulty managing daily decisions. She framed it as worry, as responsibility. She asked about assessment timelines, about what documentation would be required to establish oversight. The word oversight appeared more than once. I felt my pulse slow as I read. Not from shock, but from something colder. This wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a moment of panic. It was preparation, language chosen to sound reasonable, to sound inevitable. I checked the date. Recent. Very recent. I sat down in the chair without realizing I had done it. The room felt smaller now, as if the walls had shifted inward. My mind started assembling pieces on its own, connecting things I had dismissed before. The sudden emphasis on organization, the pressure to consolidate accounts for convenience, the way conversations had subtly shifted toward what would be easiest for everyone later. I kept digging. At the bottom of the bin was a draft document clipped together, the pages pristine, never filed. The title alone made my hands still. Petition for temporary guardianship. My name appeared in bold at the top, followed by language I had only seen when helping clients deal with aging parents: inability to manage finances, risk to personal well-being, best interests. There were no signatures, no court stamp. But it had been prepared by a law firm, formatted, complete. This was not an idea. It was a plan, waiting for timing. The wedding message snapped into place, then like a final piece sliding into a puzzle I hadn't wanted to see. Distance created narrative, absence created evidence. If I wasn't present, if I was excluded, it could be reframed as decline, confusion, emotional instability. Everything I did next would be filtered through that assumption. I took out my phone and photographed each page, carefully making sure the text was clear. I didn't rush. Panic would have made me sloppy. I noted names, dates, the firm responsible. I checked the trash again to make sure nothing else had been overlooked. Then I returned everything exactly as I had found it, smoothing the top layer of refuse back into place, restoring the illusion of carelessness. When I stood up, my knees felt weak for the first time that day. Not from age, from betrayal. I had spent years protecting my son from consequences, smoothing over his mistakes, stepping in before things became difficult. Somewhere along the way, protection had turned into vulnerability. I walked through the house slowly after that, not looking at photographs or decorations. I was recalibrating. This was no longer about hurt feelings or family drama. It was about autonomy, about control, about who got to decide when my life stopped being my own. By the time I stepped back outside, the sun was beginning to lower, casting long shadows across the lawn. I sat in my car for a few minutes without starting the engine. My hands rested on the steering wheel, steady, deliberate. I wasn't angry in the way people expect anger to look. I was clear. The next steps formed without urgency. I needed advice, not confrontation. I needed structure, not emotion. I needed to move before narrative hardened into record. The wedding wasn't just a celebration anymore. It was a deadline. I drove away without looking back at the house. There would be time for reflection later if I wanted it. For now, I understood something essential. I was not reacting to betrayal. I was responding to a threat, and that meant the rules were different. That night, I slept even less than the night before, but my thoughts were sharper. No spiraling, no rehearsed arguments, just a sequence of actions arranging themselves in my mind, each dependent on the one before it. By morning, I knew exactly who I needed to speak to and what I needed to ask. The role I had played for years, the accommodating father, the reliable safety net, was no longer available. Not because I was punishing anyone, but because it had been weaponized against me. Whatever they believed they were planning, they were counting on me remaining predictable. They were counting on hesitation. They were counting on my silence. They were wrong. I turned off the light, lay back, and stared at the ceiling until dawn began to creep in through the window. The wedding was approaching. So was something else. And this time, I would not be caught unprepared. I arrived at the law office earlier than I needed to be, and sat in my car watching people hurry past with coffee cups and briefcases, all of them moving like their days made sense. For most of my life, I had been one of them. Someone with a clear role, a schedule, a reason to be needed. That morning, I felt like I was stepping out of one life and into another without ceremony. The receptionist recognized my name when I checked in. That surprised me. I hadn't been here in years. She smiled politely, the kind of smile that doesn't ask questions. A few minutes later, the lawyer walked out himself, older now, heavier around the eyes, but with the same steady posture I remembered. He shook my hand firmly and led me down the hall without small talk. We sat across from each other in his office, a room that smelled faintly of paper and furniture polish. I took the documents out of my folder and placed them on the desk between us. I didn't explain them. I didn't frame them emotionally. I let the paper speak first. He adjusted his glasses and began to read. The silence stretched. I watched his face instead of the documents. I saw recognition before concern, calculation before sympathy. That told me everything I needed to know. When he finally looked up, he didn't soften his voice. "This isn't hypothetical," he said quietly. "This is preparation." I nodded. Hearing it confirmed didn't hurt the way I expected. It clarified. He explained the mechanics without drama, how quickly a petition could be filed if framed as urgent, how absence could be interpreted, how narratives harden once paperwork exists. He didn't accuse my son or my daughter-in-law of malice. He didn't need to. He described incentives, pressure points, opportunity. As he spoke, I felt something settle inside me. This wasn't a personal failure. It was a structural one. I had designed my life around trust without safeguards. I had assumed proximity equaled loyalty. I had been wrong. We moved on to my finances. That part took longer. Accounts I had set up for convenience. Joint access granted years ago and never reconsidered. Properties transferred partially with verbal understandings that were never formalized. Beneficiaries named when circumstances were different and never updated. None of it illegal, all of it vulnerable. "You've been generous," he said, choosing his words carefully. But generosity without boundaries reads as permission. I didn't argue. I didn't defend my past decisions. Regret would have been indulgent at that point. What mattered was what could still be done. He laid out options, defensive measures, quiet restructuring, aggressive preemption. He didn't push me toward any one path. He explained consequences, timelines, likely reactions. He reminded me that the wedding created a window, distraction on their end, distance on mine. After that, momentum would shift. I asked him one question that surprised even me. How do I protect myself without becoming someone I don't recognize? He leaned back in his chair and considered it. Then he said something simple. You don't have to punish anyone. You just have to remove the leverage. That became the guiding principle. We began immediately, not with dramatic gestures, but with paperwork, revoking discretionary access, separating accounts, locking down what should have been locked down years ago. Each signature felt like cutting a thread I hadn't realized was binding me. When I left the office, the sun was higher in the sky, the street louder. I walked slower than the crowd, not because I was tired, but because I no longer needed to keep pace with anyone else's urgency. For the first time in a long while, my next move was mine alone. The days that followed were methodical. I didn't isolate myself completely, but I changed how I responded. Messages went unanswered for hours instead of minutes. Requests were acknowledged without immediate resolution. I became politely unavailable. It didn't take long for the shift to register. Questions began to surface, framed casually at first. "Everything okay? You've been quiet. Wedding stress is crazy right now." I replied neutrally. "Busy, taking care of some things, nothing more." The less I explained, the more unsettled they seemed. At night, alone in my house, I reviewed documents and lists, not obsessively, carefully. Each item represented a decision made years ago under assumptions that no longer applied. I corrected them one by one. The will took the longest, not because of complexity, but because of memory. I remembered sitting at a different desk decades earlier, my wife beside me, deciding what we wanted to leave behind. At the time, it felt obvious. Family meant inheritance. Support meant security. Now, support had been redefined as entitlement. Security had become leverage. I didn't erase my son from my life on paper out of spite. I restructured my legacy to reflect values instead of expectation. Education, opportunity, causes that didn't see age as a liability or generosity as weakness. When I signed the final version, my hand didn't shake. Meanwhile, the wedding machine accelerated. I could feel it even without being involved. Last-minute expenses, vendor changes, subtle panic hidden beneath excitement. I watched from a distance as patterns repeated themselves. The more pressure they felt, the more they reached outward, searching for the support they assumed would always be there. It wasn't. One afternoon, my phone rang, my son's name on the screen. I let it ring, not as punishment, as practice. The second time I answered, he sounded distracted, rushed, asked how I was doing, talked about seating charts and guest lists, avoided the obvious. I responded politely, briefly. When he asked if everything was okay, I said yes. I meant it, just not in the way he assumed. After we hung up, I sat for a long time thinking about how easy it would be to explain everything, to confront him with documents, to demand accountability. That impulse passed quickly. Confrontation would only accelerate their narrative. Confusion, emotional volatility, exactly what the paperwork described. Silence. I realized was not absence, it was strategy. As the wedding drew closer, I made arrangements of my own, practical ones, mail forwarding, secure storage, travel plans that didn't leave a clear trail. I wasn't running, I was repositioning. There is a difference one people often miss. I thought often about how older men are perceived, expected to fade quietly, to relinquish control gracefully, to be managed. There is a thin line between care and control, and I had crossed it without noticing. Now I was stepping back deliberately. The night before the wedding rehearsal, I sat alone on my back porch and watched the sky darken. Somewhere, speeches were being practiced, smiles rehearsed, appearances curated. I felt no urge to be there, only a faint sadness for what family had been reduced to, a performance that required my absence to remain convincing. I finalized one last document that night. It was irreversible. I read it twice before signing. When I was done, I felt neither relief nor regret, only certainty. The door hadn't slammed. It had closed quietly without argument. They wouldn't notice immediately. That was the nature of structural change. The effects come later when weight is applied. I went to bed knowing that by the time they realized what had shifted, explanations would no longer matter. The roles they had assigned me no longer existed, and whatever happened next would not be driven by anger or revenge. It would be driven by boundaries enforced at the right moment without apology. The wedding would go on. So would my life. But only one of them was built on something solid. I woke before dawn again, not because I was anxious, but because my body seemed to understand that waiting was over. The house was still the kind of stillness that no longer felt heavy. It felt intentional. I lay there for a few minutes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint hum of the heater kicking on and off, and I knew something had shifted for good. I wasn't waiting for an apology anymore. I wasn't hoping for clarification. I was done standing in the doorway of someone else's decisions. I got up, showered, and dressed without rushing. There was no single dramatic thought pushing me forward, just a quiet understanding that if I hesitated now, everything I had begun to put in motion would stall. Waiting had always been my weakness. Patience can look a lot like surrender when it goes on too long. In the kitchen, I poured coffee and stood at the counter instead of sitting down. I didn't open my phone. I didn't check messages. That felt important. For once, the day wasn't going to begin with reacting to someone else's needs. I took a sip, set the mug down, and picked up the folder I had prepared the night before. Inside were copies of account statements, property records, insurance policies, and the photographs I had taken in the study. Everything I needed to stop guessing and start acting. The drive to the bank was uneventful. Morning traffic radio murmuring in the background, people heading into jobs they assumed would be there tomorrow. I parked, walked inside, and waited my turn like any other customer. When I sat down with the manager, I didn't tell a story. I didn't explain family dynamics. I asked clear questions and requested clear changes. Access reviewed, permissions limited, notifications rerouted. She nodded, typed, and asked for signatures. To her, it was routine. To me, it was the first visible step toward disappearing. Disappearing, I had learned, wasn't about vanishing overnight. It was about removing the assumption that I was always reachable, always available, always willing to smooth things over. It meant disentangling my life from systems that treated my presence as optional, but my resources as guaranteed. From the bank, I went straight to my lawyer's office. We had already spoken once, but today was different. Today wasn't about assessment. It was about execution. He had documents ready when I arrived. We reviewed them carefully, line by line. I asked questions. I didn't rush him. Every decision had to be deliberate. Once something was done, I wasn't going to undo it out of guilt. We started with the accounts. Some were simple. Others required explanation coordination time. He explained the sequence, what would happen immediately, and what would take days or weeks to fully settle. I appreciated that. I wasn't looking for instant gratification. I was building distance that couldn't be crossed casually. Then we turned to the will. I had known this part would be the hardest, but it surprised me anyway. Not because I doubted the decision, but because of what it represented. The original will had been written when my wife was still alive, when family felt uncomplicated. Back then, leaving everything to my son had felt like a natural extension of love. I hadn't imagined a future where love would be conditional on how well I fit into someone else's image. My lawyer didn't pressure me. He asked one question and then waited. What do you want your legacy to reflect? I thought about that longer than I expected. Legacy wasn't money. Money was just a tool. Legacy was what remained when control was gone. Respect, opportunity, the chance for someone else to stand on their own without being used. We made changes, not impulsive ones, thoughtful ones. When I signed the revised documents, my hand was steady. I didn't feel like I was punishing anyone. I felt like I was reclaiming authorship of my own life. Afterward, I sat alone in my car again, staring at the steering wheel the way I had days earlier. This time, there was no confusion, just a sober awareness of consequences. I had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. That was the point. Over the next few days, I worked through a list I had made. Automatic payments canceled, shared expenses clarified, storage units reorganized, personal items boxed and labeled. Each task was small on its own, but together they formed a pattern. I was making myself harder to reach harder, to manage harder to box into a role I hadn't agreed to. Messages began to come in. Nothing direct at first. Just check-ins. You've been quiet. Everything okay? Wedding stress is getting crazy. I responded politely when I chose to respond at all. Short replies, no explanations. The less I offered, the more uncomfortable the silence became on their end. I could feel it even without hearing their voices. One afternoon, my son called. I answered. He talked about logistics, about last-minute changes, about how hectic everything was. He avoided mentioning the message, avoided acknowledging the boundary he had set. I listened, said little, and ended the call before it drifted into anything emotional. When we hung up, I didn't feel relief or anger. I felt confirmation. The pattern hadn't changed. Only my position within it had. That evening, I started preparing to leave town. Not permanently, not yet, but far enough that showing up wouldn't be easy. I arranged mail forwarding to a secure address. I packed a bag with essentials documents, things I didn't want left behind. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. That secrecy felt heavy at first, then necessary. As I folded clothes, I thought about how often older people are expected to explain themselves, to justify their choices, to soften decisions so they don't make others uncomfortable. I had spent years doing that without realizing it. This time, I wasn't going to narrate my exit. I was going to take it. The night before I left, I walked through the house one last time, not as a goodbye, but as a check. Lights off, doors locked, everything in order. I paused in the living room, looking at a photo on the mantle from years ago. A simpler time. I didn't take it down. I didn't need to rewrite the past to move forward. I slept lightly, woke before the alarm, and loaded my bag into the car before sunrise. The street was quiet. No witnesses, no ceremony. I drove away without checking my mirrors. On the road, I felt something close to calm settle in. Not happiness, not relief, just alignment. For the first time in years, my actions matched my understanding. I wasn't reacting anymore. I was choosing. I knew they would notice soon enough. An account that didn't behave the way it used to. A call that didn't get returned. A request that went unanswered. Confusion would come first, then frustration, then fear. I didn't take pleasure in that. I accepted it as a consequence of a system they had helped build. By the time I checked into a modest hotel miles away, my phone had buzzed several times. I didn't look. I turned it off and placed it face down on the nightstand. For once, there was nothing I needed to explain. Lying on the unfamiliar bed, staring at a ceiling that didn't belong to me, I felt the weight of what I had done. Disappearing wasn't an escape. It was a declaration. I had stepped out of a story that no longer respected me. Whatever came next would be harder, more visible. There would be fallout, questions, accusations. I was ready for that. What I wasn't willing to do anymore was pretend that exclusion was acceptable as long as it was polite. I closed my eyes, listening to the distant hum of traffic, and let myself rest. The decision had been made. The door was no longer ajar. It was closed firmly and quietly, and there would be no reopening it just to make someone else feel better. The wedding was days away, so were the consequences. And this time, I wouldn't be standing still when they arrived. The house was quiet in a way that felt intentional, like someone had cleared the air before leaving. They had gone early that morning for final wedding preparations luggage, rolling across the driveway doors, closing with practiced efficiency. No one had asked if I needed anything. No one had told me how long they would be gone. I stood at the window long after their car disappeared, listening to the silence settle into the rooms. I told myself I was only there to check on a few things. The house was still partly in my name, still my responsibility in ways no one liked to acknowledge. I walked through it slowly, not touching anything at first, just letting my eyes adjust. It smelled different than it used to, less lived in, more staged. Fresh flowers in the entryway surfaces, cleared personal clutter, removed as if the house itself was being prepared for inspection. I moved toward the study without thinking much about it. My feet seemed to know the way. The door was closed this time. That alone made me pause. It had never been closed before. I stood there for a moment, my hand on the knob, aware that crossing that threshold meant something had already changed. Then I opened it. The desk looked tidy at first glance, but the order felt forced. Papers aligned too neatly, drawers pushed in all the way. I recognized the look from job sites I used to inspect, when someone cleaned up in a hurry without understanding what actually mattered. I walked around the desk, checking the corners, the floor of the trash bin tucked just out of sight. It was heavier than usual. I pulled it out and looked inside. The top layer was harmless enough. Wrappers, receipts, notes, scribbled in a rush. Beneath that, folded documents with letterhead I didn't recognize. I hesitated, feeling that old reflex to stop to respect privacy, to give the benefit of the doubt. Then I remembered the message that had erased me without explanation. Privacy had already been weaponized. I unfolded the first document carefully. It was informational, the kind of material you get handed when someone wants to sound responsible without being transparent. Elder care resources, assessment services, language stripped of warmth and reduced to function, placement options, supervision levels, compliance protocols, nothing about comfort, nothing about choice. I set it aside and continued. The next papers were emails printed and discarded without shredding. That alone told me they hadn't expected me to see them. The sender was my daughter-in-law. The recipient was an administrator at a facility several towns away. The tone was polite, measured, full of concern that felt practiced. She described changes in behavior, increasing difficulty with decisions, moments of confusion. She framed it as worry, as responsibility. She asked about timelines and documentation, about what would be required to establish oversight. Oversight. I read the word twice, then again. It wasn't accidental. It was deliberate. Oversight meant control without consent. I checked the dates. Recent. All of it recent. My first instinct was disbelief, but that passed quickly. Disbelief assumes innocence. What I felt instead was recognition. The kind that settles in when scattered details suddenly align. The pressure to simplify finances. The suggestions that things might be easier if decisions were centralized. The way conversations had shifted from what I wanted to what would be best for everyone. I sat down slowly, the chair creaking under my weight. My hands were steady. That surprised me. I expected shaking anger, something dramatic. What I felt instead was a narrowing of focus. Years of running a business had trained me for moments like this. When something goes wrong, you don't panic. You verify. I kept going. At the bottom of the bin was a clipped stack of papers, pristine, never folded. A draft. Legal formatting. Formal language. The title alone tightened my chest. Petition for temporary guardianship. My name appeared, repeatedly followed by phrases I'd seen before in other contexts, always on the other side of the table. Incapacity, risk, best interests. There were no signatures, no filing stamp. But the document was complete, ready, waiting. I didn't need to read every word to understand what it meant. This wasn't a reaction to a problem. It was preparation for one they intended to define. Distance would become evidence. Silence would be reframed as decline. Exclusion from the wedding would be recast as inability to participate. The message I had received wasn't just cruelty. It was logistics. I took out my phone and photographed each page, carefully making sure the text was clear, the dates visible, the firm's name legible. I didn't rush. I didn't miss anything. I noted the language, the assumptions baked into every paragraph. I could almost hear the explanations that would have followed if this had gone forward. It's for your own good. We just want to help. This is temporary. Temporary has a way of becoming permanent when power shifts. When I was finished, I put everything back exactly as I'd found it. I smoothed the papers, returned them to the bin, repositioned the top layer of trash. I wanted no sign that I had been there, no reason for them to accelerate the timeline. Let them believe everything was proceeding as planned. I stood up and looked around the study again. It felt different now, smaller, like a space designed for someone else's narrative. I realized then how much trust I had given, without verification, how many decisions I had allowed to be made in my absence, because I believed proximity meant loyalty. I walked through the rest of the house, slowly, not searching this time, just observing. The guest room was stripped of personal touches. The kitchen calendar was filled with reminders I hadn't been included in. My name appeared nowhere, not on schedules, not on lists, not in plans. By the time I stepped outside, the afternoon light had shifted. Long shadows stretched across the lawn. I sat on the front steps for a moment, letting the air cool my face. I didn't feel like crying. I didn't feel like shouting. I felt like someone who had just finished reading the fine print on a contract they had signed years ago without realizing the terms had changed. This wasn't about hurt feelings anymore. It was about autonomy, about who would decide when my life stopped being my own. I drove away without stopping anywhere else. The road felt longer than usual every mile, giving me more space to think. By the time I reached my place, the shock had fully worn off, replaced by something sharper. Purpose. That evening, I spread the photographs out on the table and reviewed them one by one. Not emotionally, clinically. I noted the sequence. Wedding exclusion first. Distance established. Assessment narrative prepared. Legal action drafted. It was a clean plan. I had to give them that. Clean and ruthless. I didn't tell anyone what I had found. There was no one I trusted enough yet, and no reason to tip my hand. Information is leverage, only if it remains controlled. I put the photos into a secure folder and locked them away. Sleep came late that night. Not because my mind was racing, but because it was organizing. Every action I had taken in the past week suddenly made sense. The need to review accounts, the urgency to change documents, the instinct to disappear before narratives could harden. By morning, the fear that should have come never did. In its place was a steady resolve. They had mistaken my quiet for weakness. They had assumed my patience meant consent. They had planned carefully, but they had planned around an idea of me that was outdated. I wasn't a problem to be managed. I was a variable they had failed to account for. I made a short list that morning. Not emotional goals, practical ones. Who to call, what to secure, what to move quickly on, and what could wait. The wedding wasn't just a ceremony anymore. It was a deadline. As I folded the list and put it in my pocket, I felt something close to gratitude. Not for the betrayal, but for the clarity it brought. I would rather know exactly where I stood than be welcomed politely while being erased in private. Whatever they thought they were setting in motion, they were counting on my silence and my predictability. They were counting on me staying still. They were wrong. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and stepped out into the morning with a plan forming in my mind, one step at a time. The truth had finally caught up with me. Now, it was my turn to move. I woke up before the alarm the way I had been waking up every day since the message arrived, but this morning felt different. The fear was gone. In its place was something steadier, almost clinical. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, replaying the documents I had photographed the night before. Not the betrayal itself, but the precision of it. This wasn't emotional. It was procedural. And that meant I needed someone who understood procedures better than feelings. I showered, dressed, and left the house without checking my phone. I didn't want distractions. By the time I pulled into the parking lot of the law office, the city was fully awake. People moved with purpose, unaware that a quiet war over control and dignity was unfolding behind closed doors, just like this one, every day. The building was older, brick and glass, not impressive in the way new firms tried to be. That mattered to me. This office had been here long before trends shifted, long before people learned to hide, intent behind friendly language. I sat in the waiting room, with my folder on my lap, my hands resting flat on top of it, grounding myself in the weight of what I carried. When he walked out to greet me, I recognized the look in his eyes immediately. Cautious, alert professional. The look of someone who had learned to listen before reacting. He hadn't changed much. A little grayer, a little slower, but still solid. He shook my hand and gestured for me to follow him back without asking how I'd been. That was the first sign I'd made the right call. We sat across from each other in his office. I didn't start with the wedding. I didn't explain the message. I took the photographs out of the folder and placed them on his desk one by one. I let him see the titles first, then the language, then the dates. I watched his face as he read. His expression didn't change much, but his posture did. He leaned forward. He stopped skimming. When he finally looked up, he didn't ask me how I felt. He asked when I had found them. I told him. He nodded once, then turned back to the pages. He asked careful questions. Who lived in the house? How often I stayed there? Who had access to my accounts? What documents were already in place? He wasn't building sympathy. He was building a timeline. He told me something I already suspected but needed to hear out loud. This isn't about care, he said. This is about control. He explained how these things usually unfolded, how concern was framed first, then urgency, how petitions could move quickly if someone was painted as isolated or declining, how family members who seemed cooperative were often rewarded with authority. I asked him what the risk really was. He didn't sugarcoat it. If they filed first, the burden would be on me to prove competence, not on them to prove incapacity. It would be public. It would be slow. And it would put decisions about my money, my medical care, and my freedom into someone else's hands while it played out. I felt a flicker of anger, then brief and sharp, but it passed. Anger wouldn't help. Preparation would. We moved on to my assets. This was the part I had avoided for years because it felt uncomfortable, almost greedy to think too carefully about what was mine. Now I understood how dangerous that avoidance had been. He spread out statements, deeds, and policy summaries across the desk, circling items with a pen as he talked. You're more exposed than you realize, he said. Not because you did anything wrong, but because you trusted continuity. You assumed things would stay as they were. He pointed out joint accounts I had forgotten were still active. Access permissions granted years ago that were never reviewed. Beneficiaries listed by default, not by intent. None of it malicious. All of it exploitable. I asked him what could be done quickly. He listed steps in order of urgency. Freeze discretionary access. Separate finances cleanly. Reassert control over property where my name still carried weight. Prepare filings that would block or delay any guardianship attempt before it started. The goal wasn't to attack. It was to make any move against me complicated, slow, and expensive. Then he paused and looked at me carefully. He asked what I wanted out of all this. I told him the truth. I wasn't trying to punish my son. I wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. I just wanted to live without being managed. I wanted to decide what happened to my life while I still could. He nodded. That made the strategy clearer. We started signing documents that morning. Not everything, but enough to shift the balance. I read every page. I asked questions when language felt vague. I didn't rush. Each signature felt heavier than the last, not because of regret, but because of finality. This was the line where things stopped being theoretical. When I left the office, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt grounded. For the first time since the wedding message, I wasn't reacting. I was acting with intention. Outside, I sat in my car for a few minutes before starting the engine. My phone buzzed twice. I ignored it. Whoever was calling would still be there later. My priorities had changed. Over the next few days, I followed the plan we had outlined. Some changes were immediate. Others were quieter, unfolding behind the scenes. I didn't announce anything. I didn't warn anyone. I moved the way I always had when something important was on the line, methodically and without spectacle. My son called again. This time, I answered. He sounded tense, distracted. He asked if I was feeling okay, if everything was all right. He talked around the issue, never touching it directly. I told him I was fine. I told him I had some things to take care of. I didn't explain further. After the call ended, I realized something that surprised me. He hadn't apologized. He hadn't asked about the message. He hadn't reconsidered the decision. He was checking the system, not the relationship. That confirmed everything. The lawyer called later that afternoon to update me. Some accounts were already restricted. Notices had gone out. If anyone tried to move forward with legal action now, it would raise flags. It wouldn't stop them completely, but it would slow them down. It would buy time. Time, I had learned, was power. That night, alone in my temporary apartment, I sat at the small table and reviewed my notes. I wasn't sad. I wasn't relieved. I was focused. The path ahead was clearer now. There would be fallout, confusion, accusations. I would be painted as difficult, uncooperative, perhaps even ungrateful. I accepted that. There is a moment in every man's life when he realizes that being reasonable has become a liability, when politeness is mistaken for consent, when silence is interpreted as permission. I had passed that moment without noticing. Now I was standing on the other side of it. I turned off my phone and sat in the quiet, letting the weight of what I had done settle fully. I had aligned myself with someone who understood the rules of this game. I had secured my position. I had made myself harder to corner. Whatever they thought they were planning, it would no longer move quickly or quietly. And whatever story they intended to tell about me, it would have to account for one inconvenient truth. I was still here, still capable, and no longer willing to be managed. I went to bed knowing that the next phase wouldn't be subtle. The first cracks had already formed. Soon they would notice, and when they did, the balance would finally start to shift. While they were counting down to the wedding, I was counting backward through my life, separating what belonged to me from what had been quietly borrowed. I could feel the pressure building on their side, even from a distance, the way deadlines make people sloppy. Celebration creates blind spots. It always has. I was counting on that. I stayed out of town far enough that dropping by would have required planning close enough that I wasn't hiding. The difference mattered. Hiding suggests fear. Distance suggests choice. From a small rented place with neutral walls and no history, I worked through lists I had never allowed myself to write before. Accounts, policies, properties, obligations that had once felt temporary and had hardened into expectations without my consent. The first thing I noticed was how much of my life had been automated for someone else's convenience. Recurring payments I had set up years ago and never revisited. Access permissions that made sense when my son was starting out and made no sense now. Each cancellation was quiet. No alarms, no dramatic confirmations, just a message that a process had been changed. I imagined the moment those systems would fail on their end, not all at once, but one by one, the way a power grid flickers before going dark. I received updates secondhand. A cousin asking about travel plans, a family friend mentioning seating arrangements. My name didn't come up. That absence stung, but it also clarified things. Exclusion had become normal to them. That meant any return would feel disruptive. I accepted that. I wasn't trying to reinsert myself into a picture that required my erasure to look complete. The will was the hardest work, not because of paperwork, but because of memory. I sat with my lawyer again and spoke less than before. He asked questions and waited. I thought about promises made when circumstances were different, when trust felt mutual and uncomplicated. I thought about how easily permanence turns into leverage when one side assumes the other will never leave. We rewrote it carefully. Not as an act of punishment, but as a correction. Beneficiaries aligned with values rather than blood. Provisions that rewarded effort and accountability instead of proximity. When I signed, I felt a brief ache, the kind that comes when you let go of an old belief. It passed quickly. Truth has a way of doing that. I revisited property records next. Titles, percentages, clauses I had skimmed years ago because they felt unnecessary to question. I realized how often generosity is mistaken for surrender. I had retained control in more places than they understood. Not because I was calculating, but because I was cautious. That caution had been misread as weakness. I corrected that misunderstanding without saying a word. As the days moved closer to the ceremony, messages began to arrive with a different tone. Still polite, but tighter. Requests framed as check-ins. Questions disguised as concern. I responded when it served me, and not when it didn't. Short replies, no timelines, no reassurance. Silence, I learned, unsettles people who are used to access. I prepared to vanish without drama. Mail forwarding set to a secure address. Digital accounts secured with updated credentials. Personal documents scanned and stored redundantly. I didn't pack everything. I took what mattered. Disappearing didn't require erasing my past. It required protecting my future. There was a moment one evening when doubt tried to surface. I stood in the small kitchen of the rental hands on the counter, wondering if this was too much, if I was overreacting. That moment passed when I remembered the language in the documents I had photographed. Incapacity, oversight, best interests, words chosen to sound kind while removing choice. Boundaries are not cruelty, they are clarity. I learned something else during that week. Older men are underestimated when they move quietly. People expect noise with defiance. Silence reads as compliance. I let them keep that assumption. It worked in my favor. The night before the rehearsal dinner, my son called. I answered. He sounded tired, rushed his voice carrying the strain of logistics and expectations. He talked about schedules, about last-minute changes, about how fast everything was moving. He did not mention the message. He did not apologize. He did not ask if I was coming. He was checking whether the system still worked. I told him I hoped it went well. I meant it. We ended the call quickly. When it was over, I felt no urge to call back. The absence of that urge told me everything I needed to know. I signed one more document that night, the last of the irreversible changes. I read it twice. I imagined the consequences. I signed anyway. There is a point where caution becomes avoidance. I had crossed that point days earlier. The wedding day arrived without ceremony on my end. I woke early, made coffee, and watched the light come up through unfamiliar blinds. Somewhere vows were being rehearsed, smiles practiced, appearances curated. I felt detached, not bitter. Detachment is what happens when you stop negotiating with reality. As the day unfolded, small signals reached me. A missed payment alert. A message from an intermediary asking about a confirmation that had always been automatic. I did nothing. Systems reveal truth when they're stressed. I watched and took notes. By evening, the silence from my phone grew heavier. I turned it off and went for a walk. The neighborhood was quiet, the air cool. I thought about how much of my life had been scheduled around other people's needs, how much space opened up when that stopped. Freedom isn't loud. It's subtle, like breathing without bracing. When I returned, I turned my phone back on. A handful of missed calls, a couple of messages that tried to sound casual and failed. I didn't listen to the voicemails. I knew what they would contain: confusion, frustration, the first edge of fear. I slept well that night. The next morning, I reviewed my list and checked off the final items. Everything essential was in place. The rest would unfold on its own timeline. I didn't need to orchestrate the consequences. I had only needed to stop absorbing them. I understood then that disappearing wasn't about depriving anyone. It was about ending an arrangement that had become one-sided and dangerous. If they wanted to build a life on appearances, they would have to support it without my foundation. I sat at the small table and wrote a single line on a piece of paper, not for anyone else, just for me. I am not a liability to be managed. I folded it and put it in my pocket. By the time they realized what had changed, explanations would be irrelevant. Access had been replaced by distance, assumption by verification. And the quiet man they thought they could move around had stepped out of the frame entirely. The wedding would end. The photos would be posted. The story would be told the way they wanted it told. Beneath that story, the structure had already shifted. And structures don't argue. They simply hold or they fail. I stood, gathered my things, and prepared to move again. Not away from them, but towards something that belonged to me. The door had closed without a sound. The weight would come later when they leaned on it and found it didn't open. I was ready for that. I knew something had shifted before anyone said it out loud. You can feel it when systems that used to run quietly start to grind, when assumptions meet resistance for the first time. The wedding was over. The photos were probably already being filtered and posted, but beneath the surface, nothing was settling the way it was supposed to. The first sign was small. A notification from my bank, the kind I used to skim and dismiss without a second thought. A routine transaction had failed, not because there wasn't money, but because the authorization chain no longer worked the way it once had. I noted the time, the amount, the account involved. I didn't intervene. I wanted to see what happened next. What happened next was silence, followed by confusion. I received a message from a number I recognized but hadn't heard from directly in years. It was phrased casually, almost lazily, as if this were a minor inconvenience. A question about whether I had changed something recently. No greeting, no acknowledgement of the wedding message. Just an expectation that I would step in and smooth it out like I always had. I didn't reply. By midday, the pressure increased. Another alert. Another request. This one routed through a third party, someone trying to sound helpful while fishing for information. I could almost hear the conversations happening without me, the quick reassurances, the confidence that this was a temporary glitch, the belief that I would fix it once I realized there was a problem. I let that belief sit. From a distance, I watched the pattern unfold the way I used to watch failing equipment on a job site. First denial, then improvisation, then panic. When systems are built on assumptions instead of safeguards, they hold until they don't, and when they fail fast. The wedding glow faded quicker than expected. I didn't need to be there to know it. The calls that came in were different now, shorter, less polished. voices tighter. My son called once, then again an hour later. I let both go to voicemail. When I finally listened, there was no mention of the message that started all of this. No apology. Just a strained attempt to sound normal, followed by a vague reference to some unexpected complications. Complications is what people call consequences when they don't want to name them. I took a walk that afternoon, the phone left behind on purpose. The neighborhood was quiet, ordinary, indifferent to family drama and inheritance disputes. I found that grounding. Perspective has a way of shrinking things back to their true size. What was happening wasn't chaos, it was adjustment. When I returned, there were more messages, some from my son, some from my daughter-in-law. Her tone was different now, polite, careful, threaded with concern that didn't feel rehearsed. She asked if I was feeling well, if I had everything I needed, if there was anything she could help with. The sudden interest in my well-being would have been almost amusing if it hadn't been so transparent. I replied once briefly, "I'm fine, taking care of some things." That was it. The response came quickly, a little too quickly. Questions followed. "Where are you? Are you coming back soon? We should talk." I didn't answer. Silence, I had learned, communicates more clearly than explanations ever could. The next crack appeared in the form of a vendor inquiry that somehow found its way to me. A request for confirmation on an outstanding balance. I recognized the name immediately. This wasn't supposed to reach me. This was supposed to be handled quietly, efficiently, without my involvement. The fact that it hadn't been resolved told me the safety net was gone. I forwarded the message to my lawyer without comment and archived it. That evening, I received the first call that sounded like fear. My son didn't try to hide it this time. His voice was unsteady words, tripping over each other, as he tried to explain a situation that was suddenly bigger than he could manage. He talked about timing, about misunderstandings, about people getting the wrong idea. He asked if we could meet. He asked if I could help straighten things out. I listened until he ran out of words. Then I said something I had never said to him before. I told him I wasn't available. There was a long pause on the line. I could almost hear him recalibrating, searching for a different approach. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He ended the call quickly with a tight goodbye that confirmed what I already knew. He wasn't calling because he missed me. He was calling because the structure he relied on was wobbling. Over the next few days, the cracks spread. Requests that had once been automatic now required approval. Payments that had always gone through needed explanations. People who had smiled politely at the wedding began asking questions that couldn't be brushed aside. "Where is your father? Why isn't this settled yet? Who's handling this now?" I imagined the strain that must have put on a marriage still fresh, still fragile. Stress has a way of stripping away pretense. Alliances formed around convenience don't hold when convenience disappears. I stayed quiet, not out of cruelty, but out of discipline. Intervening now would have reset the cycle. It would have taught them that pressure worked, that all they had to do was escalate enough, and I would step back into my old role. I wasn't willing to do that anymore. One afternoon, my lawyer called with an update. Nothing dramatic, just confirmation that the safeguards were holding. Attempts to access restricted accounts had been flagged. Preliminary inquiries had stalled. Whoever was pushing on the other side was meeting resistance they hadn't planned for. He asked if I wanted to escalate. I said no, not yet. That night, alone with my thoughts, I reflected on how quickly power shifts when expectations are exposed. For years, I had been the quiet constant, the one who made sure problems didn't become visible. In doing so, I had made myself invisible too. Now that I had stepped back, everything I had been holding together was revealing its true condition. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt confirmation. The most telling moment came a few days later when I received a message from someone I hadn't expected. A distant relative, someone who had attended the wedding and noticed the tension. They asked if everything was okay, if there was anything they should know. The story was leaking not in dramatic headlines, but in whispers inside conversations. The polished narrative was starting to fray. I replied with a simple line, "I'm taking some time for myself." That was all. The calls slowed after that. Not because things improved, but because people realized I wasn't the solution anymore. When a foundation is removed, you don't keep calling it. You start looking for something else to stand on. I spent that weekend going through my notes, updating timelines, preparing for what I knew would come next. The confusion phase never lasts long. It gives way to confrontation, to attempts at guilt, to appeals framed as reconciliation. I was ready for that, emotionally and structurally. On Sunday evening, I sat by the window and watched the sky darken, thinking about how different this all felt from what people imagine revenge to be. There was no shouting, no public humiliation, just a quiet refusal to continue absorbing consequences that weren't mine. I understood now that the real crack hadn't formed in their finances or their plans. It had formed in their certainty. The certainty that I would always be there. That certainty was gone. Whatever they did next would be done without a safety net. And that was the point. I turned off the light, knowing the next chapter wouldn't be subtle. The cracks were no longer invisible. They were spreading slowly and surely, and soon they would have no choice but to acknowledge what had really changed. The confrontation didn't arrive with shouting or threats. It came the way most reckonings do, wrapped in politeness disguised as concern, delivered too late to change anything. I was sitting at a small table by the window of the rental place. I had moved into a modest townhouse, a few hours away from the city, where everything used to orbit me. Morning light spilled across the wood floor, and for once, I wasn't rushing anywhere. That still felt strange. I had lived decades with my days scheduled down to the quarter hour always needed, always expected. Now my calendar was empty by design. The phone rang while I was pouring coffee. I knew who it was before I looked. There's a pattern to desperation. It calls early before courage runs out. I answered. My son didn't waste time. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't pretend this was a casual check-in. He jumped straight to the point voice, tight, trying to sound reasonable while standing on ground that was already crumbling. Dad, we need to talk. This has gone far enough. I let him speak. I had learned that silence is a mirror. People reveal themselves when they fill it. He talked about misunderstandings, about how things had escalated unnecessarily. He said words like family and forgiveness, said them carefully as if placing them on a table between us would magically rebalance the scales. He mentioned the wedding set emotions were high, that things had been said in poor taste, that no one meant to hurt anyone. I waited. Then he shifted. He talked about stress, about pressure, about how difficult it had been since the wedding. He mentioned accounts being inaccessible, deals stalling, people asking questions. He didn't say panic, but it was there, breathing between his sentences. Finally, he asked me to meet. I agreed. Not because I owed him anything, but because clarity is sometimes best delivered face to face. We met 2 days later at a diner just off the highway, the kind of place where no one pays attention to who you are or who you used to be. That felt intentional on his part. Neutral ground, no witnesses, no history on the walls. He arrived late, another tell. He looked different, not just tired, smaller somehow. The confidence he wore so easily when I was footing the bill had thinned. He sat across from me, hands wrapped around a coffee mug. He hadn't ordered, eyes scanning my face for clues. I didn't give him any. He started again with apologies this time, but they were vague, unfocused. Sorry if you felt hurt. Sorry if things came across the wrong way. He never said sorry for the message. Never said sorry for asking me not to attend his wedding. Never said sorry for choosing comfort over respect. I let that stand. When he realized I wasn't going to rescue him with reassurance, frustration crept in. His voice sharpened. He asked why I was doing this, why I was making things harder than they needed to be. He said families fight, families forgive, families don't blow things up over one bad moment. That's when I spoke. I told him this wasn't about the wedding. It never was. The wedding was just the point where the truth stopped hiding. I told him I wasn't punishing him. I was opting out of being managed, sidelined, and called when money was needed, but presence was inconvenient. He pushed back, said I was overreacting, said I was being dramatic, said his wife's family had strong opinions, and it was easier to go along than make waves, easier for whom I asked. He didn't answer. I told him something else then, something I had never articulated out loud. I told him that when he asked me not to come, when he chose their comfort over my dignity, something broke, not emotionally, structurally. Trust is not a feeling, it's an agreement. And he had voided it. He leaned back, exasperated, and finally said what he had been circling since the call. He asked if I would restore access, if I would step back in and help stabilize things until they got back on their feet. He said it would just be temporary. He said they would do better. I shook my head. That answer hit him harder than anger ever could. He stared at me like I had spoken a foreign language. For the first time, I think he realized I meant it, that this wasn't a phase or a tactic. This was a permanent shift. He asked what he was supposed to do. I told him that was no longer my responsibility. The conversation unraveled after that. Accusations replaced apologies. He said I was abandoning him. He said I was choosing pride over family. He said I would regret this when I was alone. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I told him I had spent decades making sure he was never alone, that he had confused support with entitlement, that the reason this felt like abandonment was because he had never learned to stand without leaning on me. He left before the check came. That was the last time I saw him. The fallout accelerated after that. I didn't need updates, but they came anyway. Mutual acquaintances reached out, carefully testing the waters. I kept my responses brief. I wasn't interested in managing the narrative. Let the truth travel at its own speed. My lawyer called a week later to confirm what I already expected. Formal notices had been issued. Lines of credit officially closed. Obligations called in. The safety nets that had quietly cushioned reckless decisions were gone. The consequences were no longer theoretical. I asked him one question. Is everything secure on my end? He said yes. That was enough. I took a drive that afternoon, no destination in mind, just movement. The road stretched out ahead of me, familiar and unfamiliar at the same time. I realized something then that surprised me. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even sad in the way I thought I would be. I felt clear. Clarity is underrated. People mistake it for coldness because it doesn't perform grief the way they expect. But clarity is honest. It doesn't beg. It doesn't threaten. It simply states what is and moves accordingly. That night, my phone buzzed again. A long message this time. His wife. The tone was different from before. Less guarded. More raw. She wrote about stress, about fear, about how things had spiraled. She said they felt attacked. She said they didn't understand why this was happening all at once. I read it once. Then I set the phone down and didn't reply. Not because I didn't understand, because understanding doesn't obligate rescue. The days that followed were quiet. I settled into a routine. Morning walks, simple meals, reading without distraction. For the first time in years, my energy was my own. I wasn't bracing for the next request or crisis. I wasn't waiting for the phone to ring. I thought about how often people mistake access for love, how they believe proximity entitles them to control. I had played that role willingly for too long, thinking sacrifice was the same as connection. It isn't. The final confirmation came when I received notice that they had been forced to make decisions without me. Real decisions, hard ones, downsizing, explaining things they had never planned to explain, facing questions they had hoped would never be asked. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt finished. That night, I sat at the kitchen table paperwork, spread out neatly, and made the last adjustments I had been putting off. Everything was in order. Everything was intentional. Nothing was reactive anymore. When I turned off the light and went to bed, there was no sense of dread about what tomorrow would bring. Only the knowledge that whatever came next, I would meet it on my own terms. And that was something no one could take from me again. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was active, like a held breath that finally released. Weeks passed without another call from my son. No late-night apologies, no half-formed threats dressed up as concern. The noise had burned itself out. What remained was aftermath. I learned about it the way you learn about storms, once they've already passed through by the debris they leave behind. A friend from the old neighborhood mentioned seeing moving trucks outside the house. I once helped them buy. Another said the wedding photos had quietly disappeared from social media. Someone else mentioned legal trouble, nothing specific, just the tone people use when they lower their voice and say things didn't work out the way they planned. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. One afternoon, my lawyer called to confirm the final filings had cleared. Everything was settled, documented, sealed. My assets were where I wanted them. My will reflected my decisions clearly, deliberately, without ambiguity. No loose ends, no leverage left dangling. He asked if I wanted copies mailed over. I told him to keep them on file. I trusted him, and more importantly, I trusted myself. That evening, I went for a long walk through the neighborhood where I was staying. It wasn't picturesque. No manicured lawns or polished facades. Just real people living real lives. A couple arguing quietly on a porch. A teenager practicing guitar badly with enthusiasm. An older man washing his car with methodical care. No one knew who I was. No one expected anything from me. The relief in that anonymity surprised me. I realized how long I had been performing a role without questioning it. Provider, fixer, buffer. I had allowed myself to be reduced to function, and then wondered why I felt invisible. It wasn't malice that did it. It was permission. That night, I dreamed about my late wife for the first time in months. Not in fragments or flashes, but clearly. We were sitting at a small table, nothing fancy, just coffee between us. She looked at me the way she used to when she knew I was struggling but hadn't admitted it yet. "You did what you had to do," she said. I woke up calm. A few days later, I received a letter forwarded from my old address. My son's handwriting on the envelope. Familiar, careful. The kind he used when he wanted something, but wasn't sure how to ask. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter and let it sit there for hours like a test. When I finally did open it, the words inside were uneven. Apologies mixed with justification. Regret tangled up with resentment. He wrote about pressure, about expectations, about how everything had gotten out of hand. He said he wished things had gone differently. He said he missed me. He didn't say he understood. That mattered. I folded the letter and placed it back in the envelope. I didn't tear it up. I didn't respond. Some things don't require a reply to be resolved. The real closure came quietly without ceremony. It was a Saturday morning when I realized I hadn't thought about them in days. Not with anger, not with sorrow, not even with that familiar background hum of worry. The absence of that weight felt almost unsettling at first, like forgetting to wear a watch you'd had on your wrist for years. I sat on the porch with a cup of coffee and watched the light change across the street. I thought about the years ahead, not in grand plans, but in manageable pieces. Time to read, time to travel if I wanted, time to sit still without feeling guilty. I thought about legacy. For most of my life, I believed legacy meant passing something down. Money, property, opportunity. I had focused so much on what I could give that I hadn't asked what I was teaching by giving it unconditionally. Now legacy looked different. It looked like boundaries, like choosing where my energy went, like refusing to subsidize disrespect. I had redirected my resources quietly, intentionally, toward causes that aligned with my values, toward people who would never know my name, but would benefit from the choices I made. It felt right in a way that surprised me. Later that week, I ran into an old colleague from years back. We hadn't seen each other in a decade. He asked what I'd been up to. I told him the truth, or at least the part that mattered. I said I had simplified my life. He nodded, like he understood more than I'd said. As we talked, I noticed something else. I wasn't defensive. I wasn't explaining myself. I wasn't bracing for judgment. I was simply stating facts. That felt new, powerful in a quiet way. There was no final showdown, no dramatic apology, no moment where everything snapped back into place. Real life rarely offers that kind of symmetry. Instead, there was acceptance. The understanding that some relationships don't end in reconciliation, but in recognition. Recognition of limits, of patterns, of truths that can't be unseen once you've named them. I had named mine. One evening, as I organized the last of my belongings, I found an old photo tucked into a book. Me and my son, when he was small, standing in the backyard, his hand wrapped around my finger. I studied it for a long time. Love had been real. That mattered. But love doesn't erase responsibility, and it doesn't obligate you to stay in places that shrink you. I placed the photo back where I found it. I wasn't erasing the past. I was contextualizing it. The final call came unexpectedly, not from my son, but from a mutual acquaintance who didn't know the full story. He said there were rumors that people were talking, that some thought I'd gone too far. I thanked him for the concern and told him I was doing just fine. After we hung up, I sat for a moment and considered that question. Had I gone too far? The answer came easily. No, I hadn't retaliated. I hadn't humiliated. I hadn't sought revenge. I had simply stepped out of a dynamic that required me to diminish myself to keep others comfortable. That isn't cruelty. It's self-respect. As the days continued, my life settled into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Not perfect, not free of sadness, but honest. I stopped checking my phone compulsively. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. I stopped waiting for permission to exist fully. What surprised me most was the absence of fear. I had been afraid for so long, afraid that if I withdrew support, everything would collapse, that I would be blamed, that I would be alone. Some things had collapsed. I wasn't alone. That realization stayed with me as I closed the door that night and turned off the lights. The quiet wasn't threatening anymore. It was earned. And for the first time in a long time, I slept deeply without the weight of unfinished business pressing against my chest. Whatever came next, I was ready to face it as myself, not as a function. And that made all the difference. I woke up before sunrise without an alarm, not because I had somewhere to be, but because my body finally trusted the day ahead of it. The room was quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel empty but intentional. No buzzing phone on the nightstand, no calendar reminders pulling me toward obligations I never agreed to. Just light beginning to stretch across the ceiling, slow and patient. For a long time, I lay there thinking about how strange peace can feel when you first let it in. It doesn't arrive like relief. It arrives like unfamiliar territory. You keep waiting for something to go wrong. Nothing did. I made coffee and sat by the window, watching a delivery truck idle at the corner, a woman walking her dog, a man jogging with headphones in. Ordinary life unfolding without my involvement. That used to scare me. Being unnecessary felt like erasure. Now it felt like freedom. Weeks had passed since the last call, the last letter, the last attempt to pull me back into a story I no longer belonged to. I hadn't blocked anyone out of spite. I simply stopped reaching for the phone when it rang with numbers I already knew by heart. Silence, I learned, is not avoidance when it's chosen. It's a boundary. I thought about what I still had, my health, my name, my choices, and what I had let go of. The need to be liked at my own expense. The habit of fixing problems that weren't mine. The quiet humiliation of being tolerated only when I was useful. There was a time when I believed family meant endurance, that love meant absorbing discomfort so others wouldn't have to, that aging meant shrinking politely so younger people could feel bigger. I know better now. Later that morning, I drove to the coast, not because I planned it, but because the road felt open. I parked near the water and walked along the shoreline, shoes in my hand, the cold surf brushing my ankles. The wind was sharp clean. It stripped away any leftover hesitation. I thought about my son, not with bitterness, but with a kind of sober clarity. I could still remember him as a child, the way he used to fall asleep on my chest during long drives, trusting me completely. That version of him was real. So was the man he became. Both truths can exist without canceling each other out. I didn't wish him harm. I didn't hope for suffering. I hoped for growth, the kind that only happens when no one rushes in to cushion the fall. Some lessons don't arrive gently. They arrive honestly. That afternoon, I stopped by a small office downtown, the kind most people walk past without noticing. Inside, I finalized paperwork I had been working on quietly for months. Funds redirected, accounts sealed, commitments clarified. The woman behind the desk smiled and thanked me, not knowing the weight of what she was holding. To her, it was just another file. To me, it was the final confirmation that my life was no longer on pause. I wasn't disappearing. I was reappearing somewhere else. That night, I cooked dinner for myself. Nothing fancy, just food I liked, eaten slowly. No rushing, no interruptions. I turned on music I hadn't listened to in years and let it play through without skipping tracks. I realized then how often I had confused noise with connection. The following days fell into a rhythm that felt sustainable. Morning walks, long conversations with myself that didn't end in self-blame, planning trips I might take or might not. For the first time, the choice itself mattered more than the outcome. One afternoon, while organizing a drawer, I found an old wedding invitation I had never thrown away. Cream-colored, paper elegant script. My son's name printed proudly at the top. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel anger. I felt distance. And distance, I learned, doesn't always mean loss. Sometimes it's the only way to see clearly. I folded the invitation and placed it back where I found it. Not as a wound, but as a marker. This is where things changed. As the weeks turned into months, people stopped asking questions. The story lost its heat. Scandals always do. What remains is what you build after the noise fades. I built something quieter, a life without performance, without bargaining, without explaining myself to people who had already decided what role I should play. I learned to sit with my age instead of apologizing for it. 67 isn't an expiration date, it's a vantage point. You see patterns others are still trapped inside. You recognize manipulation faster. You understand that time is the only currency that doesn't replenish. That knowledge is power if you let it be. One evening, sitting on the porch as the sun dipped low, I caught myself smiling for no reason at all. Not because something good had happened, but because nothing bad was looming. That was new. I thought about how close I came to spending the rest of my life negotiating my own worth, hoping for scraps of respect, mistaking obligation for love. I thought about how easily it could have continued if I hadn't stopped when I did. Walking away wasn't easy. It was necessary. I didn't punish anyone. I didn't seek revenge. I simply stopped protecting people from the consequences of their choices, and I stopped sacrificing my dignity to keep the peace. There is a difference. As night settled in, I turned off the lights and stood for a moment in the quiet, listening to the hum of the house. It felt like mine. Not because my name was on a document, but because my presence wasn't conditional. That's when I understood something fully. Respect isn't something you earn once and keep forever. It's something you defend, even when it costs you relationships you thought would last, especially then. If you're listening to this and you've ever felt sidelined, minimized, or made to feel like your value had an expiration date, I want you to know this isn't just my story. It happens quietly in families, in marriages, in lives built on obligation instead of respect. Walking away doesn't mean you failed. Sometimes it means you finally chose yourself. If this story resonated with you, if it made you pause or recognize something in your own life, I'd like to hear your thoughts. Share them in the comments. These conversations matter more than people admit. And if you want to stay with this channel for more stories about dignity boundaries and what it really means to start over later in life, I invite you to subscribe and stay a while. Some endings aren't tragic. They're necessary. This was one of them.